Once I have it in this position, I can simply ventilate the patient by putting my ventilatory device on the connector of the endotracheal tube, because the cuff of the endotracheal tube, even if it's completely decompressed, is enough to seal off the distal part of the tube of the airQ so that I can use the mask to breathe for the patient. So I don't have to take everything all out again to ventilate the patient. This is important because this allows you to be able to ventilate during intubation attempts, and your patient doesn't have to be apneic, and it makes it much, much safer. Now, if I had missed and I put my endotracheal tube in this position, you have a couple choices. I usually like to use a flexible bronchoscope at this point to actually look and see where the endotracheal tube is going. Now, if I'm lucky enough to have one of these devices, which is a bronchoscopic side port adapter made for bronchoscopes, I put that on the endotracheal tube connector, put about a cc of air into the cuff of the endotracheal tube, and it allows me to ventilate the patient while I use my bronchoscope down the scope and put the bronchoscope into the trachea, and then I simply pass the tube forward into the trachea over the bronchoscope. This allows you to ventilate your patient during the intubation attempt. Now, it doesn't get any safer than that. If you're moving air, you're safe. As long as you're moving air, your patient will not become hypoxic, and you have a lot more time to do the flexible bronchoscopy and to put the endotracheal tube into the patient. The good news is this is really easy to do. The airQ will get everything out of the way and line up everything for you. So all you have to do is move the scope about straight ahead, about 1 inch, and you'll be in the trachea, run the endoscope down toward the carina, and then advance the endotracheal tube. If you're lucky enough and you happen to have a bronchoscope near your intubation place, then typically what I do at that point, instead of using the bronchoscopic adapter, I might just back it up to 18, run the flexible scope right down the endotracheal tube quickly into the trachea, and simply advance the endotracheal tube over the flexible bronchoscope without the use of the side port adapter. I think the side port adapter is really nice because it allows you to ventilate during the intubation attempt, but if you're reasonably clever with a bronchoscope and you have it available, it's probably not necessary. This allows you to do the intubation while you're ventilating the patient and maximizing the oxygen saturation. So once you've had the patient intubated and you've verified the placement using your stethoscope, now what? Well, in emergency medicine, particularly, most of the time you're just going to leave this whole mess together right away. You might have to send the patient upstairs for a CT scan or something, but you can actually, because the airQ is soft, you can just leave this all in. Now, eventually you're going to want to start removing these devices, because if you want to send the patient upstairs to the emergency room or into the ICU, you're going to want to start taking this stuff out. Well, it's really pretty easy to do, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. First thing I take out usually is the blocker tube. Now, if you have an NG tube, you don't have to do that. I would just take the NG tube out under suction, decompress the stomach as I go, and use the NG tube to suck out the pharynx on the way by. Now, if you have the blocker tube in, it's very easy to do. It's basically do the same thing. Make sure you suck all the air out of the blocker tube. I usually hook it in to suction. I put it on suction, and I start sucking as I go. I suck out the pharynx, and I just remove the device. And now I'm down to the airQ and the blocker and the endotracheal tube. Now, to remove the airQ blocker and leave the endotracheal tube in place, it's also very easy to do. To do that, you need one of these devices, the airQ removal stylet. Now, it comes in 3 different sizes. I got one for medium, one for adults, and one for little babies. We're going to use the large one, the size 1 for adults, to take this endotracheal tube out. The first thing you want to do when you try to take the airQ blocker out is you want to decompress the cuffs. So take all the air out of the cuffs of the airQ device and take all the air out of the endotracheal tube. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to hold the endotracheal tube with a 4x4 or some kind of gauze so we can hold on to it really well, and we're going to remove the connector of the endotracheal tube. Now keep this in your pocket so you don't lose it, because you're going to have to put it back into the endotracheal tube when you're finished. We're going to set it right here on the table for now. And you take the airQ removal stylet and you place it into the endotracheal tube, and as you're pushing it into the endotracheal tube, you're going to turn it clockwise to lock it into place. Now this takes a little while to learn, but you'll finally get the trick. Now you don't want to put it in a bunch of times because then you're going to have to unscrew it later. So just as you push it in, twist it to the right, it'll lock itself into place. So now we'll have control of the endotracheal tube. Now the next thing I'm going to do is put a little bit of lubrication on the cuff of the endotracheal tube so it slides through the airQ a little easier. I'm going to push the endotracheal tube into the lungs a little deeper first until the pilot balloon is in about this position. So I basically run the tip of the endotracheal tube down next to the carina. That just gives me a little room to play with so I won't inadvertently extubate them. Then I'm going to stop pushing on the stylet and I'm just going to hold it in place like this. And as I'm holding it in place, I'm going to use countertraction on the stylet to start to bring the airQ blocker out. I usually straighten up the blocker tube as I go so I can bring it straight up in the air. I pull it out like this. Then I usually back up the endotracheal tube and put it in the right position. Grab the proximal end of the endotracheal tube, unscrew my blocker tube, place my connector back in, air up the endotracheal tube, adjust the position of the tube, and then make sure I didn't pull the endotracheal tube out, make sure it's still in the endotracheal.